Hello, and welcome to this presentation on conducting a successful scoping review project. This series will address different steps involved in conducting a scoping review. And today's session will focus on the first step, which is planning your review. We'll go through lots of different phases of this first initial step, just to make sure that the more time you spend preparing your search, the easier it will be to find content, analyze it, and then summarize it as part of your project. I like this particular citation that comes from a book published a few years ago in Pettigrew and Roberts. It states that systematic reviews, or in our case, scoping reviews, are not just big literature reviews. And I think that's an important thing, an important distinction between traditional literature reviews, with which a lot of people have conducted as part of larger research projects. But scoping or systematic reviews are research projects in and of themselves. And so when you're starting a scoping review project, you know you're getting involved in something that's going to be more systematic, more rigorous than a traditional literature review. So that's an important citation, I think, to start off with as a reminder of what's being done. There's been an exponential growth over the years in terms of the use or the presentation or publication of scoping reviews in the field of education, just as an example. It's across all disciplines. But here's an example of results from a very simple search where I looked for the word scoping in the title of references found or indexed in the education source database. And you can see 10 years ago in 2014, I think the number is around 16 references came up with that search. And in 2024, we're just under 700 results. And so you can see over time that scoping reviews have gained in terms of momentum and in terms of publication. And so there's a reason for that. Scoping reviews tend to offer something different than systematic reviews. And authors who really know the methodology of scoping reviews are labeling it correctly as well, which is a nice thing to see in the literature. And so this exponential growth, again, not just unique to education, but across all different fields, warrants, I think, the need to reflect on the steps to take in order to produce a quality system, a scoping review. Today's presentation will focus on these different aspects. I think it's important to spend a few minutes properly defining what is a scoping review and how it's different than a systematic review. And those two review types are part of a larger field of reviews. There are different typologies that have been published that summarize what's been done, or summarize the different types that you can delve into. Obviously, the more popular ones tend to be the systematic review and the scoping review. And because we are seeing more scoping reviews emerge, I think it's important to take time to really define it properly and to understand the steps involved in this particular methodology. We'll also talk about the importance of setting up review or research questions as part of the process. It's an important piece of the puzzle. It's the starting point, really. Whatever your research question is will guide the steps that you take. And sometimes your review question will also help determine if a scoping review is appropriate or not. We'll look also at the importance of searching for previously published reviews, not only to make sure that one doesn't exist on your particular question, but also to help understand what's already been done, and also to inform the search strategy that you'll develop as part of the process. We'll also talk about the importance of the inclusion and exclusion criteria. What do those look like and what do they mean in the process of preparing your review? And we'll also delve into the importance of preparing a protocol. It's a very important step that should be taken as part of the process. And so we'll spend a bit of time towards the end talking about how to set up and how to produce and make available a protocol for your scoping review. So what is a scoping review? Essentially, a scoping review aims to address a broad, complex, and exploratory research question that seeks to better understand a phenomena. I think what's important here is the distinction between a systematic and a scoping review tends to be with the review question itself. In a systematic review, researchers are trying to find a specific they're asking a very specific question as opposed to a broader one in the context of a scoping review. So keep that in mind, a specific question for systematic reviews, a broad question in the context of a scoping review. It's often also a preliminary attempt to identify the nature and extent of available research. So, when you're preparing a scoping review, the idea is to cast the net as widely as possible, collect as much evidence to help answer a broad question, to really identify what's out there, and perhaps also to lead in to a more specific question that might be developed as part of a more intensive research project. The scoping and systematic review methodologies use the same approach for identifying the literature. It tends to offer a rigorous approach to that process where both in scoping and systematic reviews, the researchers use very systematic, exhaustive search strategies to find, as I said, as much of the literature as possible on a specific topic. That's obviously impossible, even in an ideal situation where you have a team of researchers and you have all the resources available. Finding everything that's out there is hard, but the challenge for scoping or systematic review is trying to do the best job possible at not missing anything significant. And that will be something that's covered more in the second video of this series, where you can really learn more about identifying sources of evidence. Characteristics which mirror some of the points we just mentioned that really make a scoping review unique is the nature of the question being more general. As I mentioned, the word broad. So you do want to create that more general research question that will guide your scoping review process. The search strategies will be systematic, but also transparent and reproducible. That's an important aspect of reviews that fall under the knowledge synthesis umbrella. So, as opposed to a literature review that you would do for an article, you can sort of find articles here and there and not necessarily report on which approach you use to find those articles. However, when you're doing any other type of review, whether it's systematic, scoping, integrative, a meta analysis, you want to be able to provide the readers with your approach. So, which databases were searched, how those databases were searched, and what any limits that you used, and making that available so that someone can replicate that should they want to verify if your approach found actually all the research that has been published. Also, there are predefined inclusion and exclusion criteria that are set up to guide in the screening process. Again, that will be part of the video series. In video 3, we'll talk a bit about how to screen using the inclusion and exclusion criteria that are set up at the very beginning of the project. Now, one thing that is different from the systematic review is the need to appraise the articles that end up included in your review itself. So the included studies, typically in a systematic review, are appraised for quality, among other things. In the context of a scoping review, because the literature that you find can be from peer-reviewed sources, it could be government information that you find, it could be gray literature that comes from other sources. It's really a mix of things that end up in your pile. It's hard to use a critical appraisal tool because the study design is totally different from one reference to the next. And so there is minimal evaluation that usually takes place in the context of a scoping review. And finally, the synthesis tends to be qualitative as opposed to quantitative in a systematic one. So a scoping review tends to provide a narrative of what was found, sort of categorizing either by theme or by type of research what's been located through the identification stage. And so that makes it a bit different as well in terms of the synthesis part of the scoping review. Here are some examples of titles taken from actual scoping reviews, and the titles themselves are indicative of the broader nature of the concepts studied or the research questions posed in these particular articles. So, as we just roll through the examples here, depression in a young autistic people. So, as you can see, it's nothing too specific, it's very general to find out how depression is lived through by young autistic people. There's also another example here of the inclusive practices of classroom teachers. And the last one, also very broad in its nature, just the title itself, definitions, key themes, and aspects of the concept of aging in place. And so, without going into too many details about these three articles, I just wanted to share the title so that you can see here how broadly the researchers sort of addressed each of these issues. And that sort of leads into some or follows up on some of the points that we just discussed. So now that we have a better understanding of what a scoping review is and what are some of the elements that fit under the umbrella or the definition of scoping reviews, there's also an important piece here where we want to consider some key methodological papers. And there are two of them among others. And these are ones that I tend to refer to review teams as guidance for structuring and preparing their review. Now, there's a distinction between methodological papers and reporting guidelines. And you will talk a bit more about the Prisma guideline, which is a reporting guideline. That is a structure or an approach or a checklist that can be used in terms of formatting and structuring the final review, but it doesn't provide guidance in the steps involved in conducting the review itself. So these two papers are among many others, as I mentioned, that could be used to help guide your process. So Arksy and O'Malley is sort of the key article that was published 20 years ago already that sort of sets the stage of what a scoping review looks like. And then in 2020, so a few years ago, Peters and company sort of published an update on that guidance. If you notice the DOI, it has the letters JBI, and JBI is one organization that does a lot of work in terms of providing guidance and other opinions around different methodologies related to knowledge synthesis. And so, if you're interested, you can always Google JBI and find out more. But these two papers would be ones that I would recommend that you cite in your methods as guidance and helping you sort of understand the steps involved. Now, without going into too many detail about these two papers, very quickly, Arksy and O'Malley sort of structure the scoping review in five distinct steps. One, identifying the research question. Two, identifying relevant studies. So that's how you go about searching. Three is selecting studies. So how you go about screening the titles and abstracts, screening the full text, and how you choose the articles that end up in your review. Once those are selected, how do you chart the data? And we'll talk a bit more about charting the data in the fourth video of this series. And there's a newer paper that was published that really helps with this step because it's always been something that researchers who publish scoping reviews tended to have questions around how to chart data. So that recent article, which we'll reference in video 4, really helps in terms of understanding that process. And lastly, collating and summarizing and reporting the results. Obviously, once everything's been screened, selected, charted, then how do you summarize and present that in your final report? Now, what happened in 2020, Peters and company sort of did an update to clarify certain points that were a bit not as fleshed out in the original article. One was the importance of registering a protocol, and we'll talk about that today and why that would be helpful. Also, in terms of providing more guidance in terms of how to create or formulate a review question in the context of scoping reviews. They also expanded on the inclusion and exclusion criteria, and they used a framework called PCC, Population, Concept, and Context. I'll talk a bit more about that in a few slides as well. And finally, they elaborated on this idea around data analysis in the context of a scoping review. So again, these two papers sort of complement each other, and I would recommend that any review team that embarks on a scoping review project consider them for their to guide them through the process. So some of the preliminary tasks involved in preparing a scoping review include verifying if other reviews have been published. As I said earlier, identifying a research or a review question to guide the whole project as well. But it's also important to assemble a review team. And I know that that's not always possible, especially if students are undertaking a review on their own. However, it's a good idea if you can to find colleagues to help out at different stages. Now, colleagues can include obviously subject matter experts who are oftentimes the principal investigator on a review project. There can be volunteers who will help at different stages of screening titles and abstracts or screening the full text. There's also other people such as myself, librarians, who can join teams. I'm on many review projects because I bring expertise when it comes time to identify the literature that feeds into the evidence that will be screened. So there's also other methods experts that can provide some guidance throughout different steps of the project. So your review team can be composed of quite a number of people. Also, it's important to set a timeline. I often get this question: how long should a review project take? And it can be as short as a few months and as long as a few years, or sometimes even longer, depending on how motivated the team is or how many references they end up having to screen. However, what I want you to take away from that comment is that a review project is not something that gets done overnight. Anyone who's worked on a review before will definitely be able to tell you that it's not something that can be quickly done. And so, setting a timeline that's realistic within the project's goal is something that's important at the onset. Also, you'll have a better idea once the search strategies are run, how many results you get and how long that will take to screen. And so, there's a bit of fluctuation that can happen in terms of the timeline itself. Finally, the importance as a preliminary task of writing a protocol. We'll look into those elements a bit later as well. So, in terms of formulating a research question as the first step, one model that can be used is called the PCC framework. And there are many different models out there or frameworks to help you formulate a question for a review project. Some of you might have heard of the PICO format, which stands for Population, Intervention, Comparison, and Outcome. So PICO. That's heavily used in the health sciences to sort of look at, or even more so in systematic reviews, not just in health or medicine, but the idea is that there's a population, then there's an intervention. There are comparisons of what that intervention would or would not do to that population, and then potentially identifying some outcomes or some expected outcomes. When adopting a framework for more social sciences or education related question, PCC seems to work better because it's a little bit more flexible, a bit more vague in its approach. So there is always a population, or in most cases a population, but the P could also stand for phenomena or for problem. And so that first concept relates to that aspect. Then you also have the concept. So that would translate a little bit to the intervention. So what are you interested in looking at? And then what is the context or the setting in which that happens? So, for example, what is the relationship between mental health literacy and positive mental health of family caregivers of dependent persons in home settings? This is a question taken from a published scoping review. And if we use the PCC approach here, we can identify the population, in this case, family caregivers of dependent persons. We can identify the concept, which is the relationship between mental health literacy and positive mental health. And then there's the context, which would in this case be in a home setting. And so if we stop and look at this question, that's sort of how we can look at the PCC framework. And so oftentimes you can identify elements of PCC, so the population, the concept, and the concept upfront, and then work around that to formulate your research question. And you can see from the nature of this question too that it fits nicely with the model or the approach of having a broad question. So it's the relationship between two aspects in a certain population, specifically family caregivers. Moving from the research question to the next step, which would be verifying for previously published reviews. And you might be wondering, well, why do I do that? As I mentioned earlier, there are a few reasons to do that. One is that you don't necessarily want to replicate a very recent review. There's no need to do that. Unless it's completely flawed, in that case, you can argue that there is a rationale for producing an updated review. Now, you can also decide that a previously published review, even 5, 10 years ago, didn't include obviously current literature. So that's one other rationale for updating a previously published review. But also, I see lots of reviews that are published that rely on Google Scholar and maybe one other database, which is totally wrong in the context of running any type of review, whether it be systematic or scoping. And so there is reason sometimes to say, let's improve that method and provide a more rigorous review to help inform decision making, or practice. You can also use them as examples. So, obviously, if you're not fully aware of all the databases that exist, or if you haven't done search strategies for reviews before, looking at previously published examples can help identify which databases might be worth targeting, also in terms of the search terms that are used. And so sometimes if you don't find a review that's Specifically related to your question, you could decide to run a search to find reviews, for instance, on family caregivers. So, how has that concept been searched in other reviews? And so you can start gathering pieces to help in elements that we'll look at in video two, which is on identifying sources. In order to find these previously published reviews, I simply go to Google Scholar, type in a few keywords related to the research question, and then type in title colon review or in title colon meta. Most meta analyses, most systematic scoping, other types of reviews include that as a subtitle to their title. And so they'll have the name of the title, depression in young autistic people, colon, a scoping review. And so if you search in Google Scholar or in any database with searching for the word review in the title, that's a quick way of finding review articles. There are a few other tools like Campbell's Systematic Reviews and the Cochrane Library that publish systematic reviews. So Campbell publishes mostly in the social sciences, education, and law, whereas the Cochrane Library focuses on medicine and health sciences. So you could turn to those two to find examples as well. And they're usually seen as the gold standard. So their methods are pretty thorough and rigorous, and so they serve as good examples for finding keywords and search strategies as well. Prospero is a tool more in the health sciences that acts as a repository for publishing protocols. So, unless you're producing a systematic review in the health sciences, you won't necessarily find something in Prospero, but you might find examples of certain aspects of your question if they relate to health. We'll talk a bit more about Prospero later as well. Now, in terms of identifying inclusion and exclusion criteria, it's important to do that on the onset. However, they can evolve as you're working through your project. So sometimes those might change throughout the different stages. It's a good idea to have them up front. So, what are you going to include in your study or in your review, and what will you exclude? And those elements are often tied to your review questions. So, coming back to PCC, you have criteria related to participants. So, for instance, if you're interested in studies that deal with children, oftentimes there are studies that include children and adolescent. Well, if the data in those reports are distinct, you could decide to include, but you might want to exclude anything that doesn't deal with children. So that's one element that could help and understand how to set up an inclusion criteria for participants. The same would happen for concepts and context as well. But then you also have criteria that could be related to publication. So, types of publication or dates of publication, perhaps also languages. Sometimes review teams will focus just on languages that team members can read, for instance. Sometimes also, less so in the context of scoping reviews, criteria can be linked to study design. So only randomized control trials, or only qualitative studies, or only observational studies, whatever it is, that could be part of the criteria as well. Now, the criteria is often used at the screening and evaluation phases and not at the searching phase. You will not typically use inclusion criteria to limit out results when you're searching. Unless, oftentimes, the only one I would use would be the date cutoff. But again, when you're choosing all of these elements, they have to be justified. So if you're selecting a date as a cutoff, it has to be related to something. So the introduction of a specific method or a specific intervention to solve a problem, when that was first introduced, that could be your cutoff date for publications. So there has to be some explanation behind your criteria. Now we get to the part where once all of this is sort of set up, we can think about preparing a protocol. And this basically means that you're going to draft or prepare a document that really outlines the different steps that will take place as part of your project. Sort of like a game plan or outline of the different phases of the review project. And to be honest, it's a nice exercise to go through. I see a lot of review teams that don't do this, and then they go back to the drawing board, sort of set out what needs to be included in their review, and it sort of gets them to think about the different phases involved, and also set up different elements related to their review project. Now, again, I mentioned Prisma earlier, which is a reporting standard for systematic reviews and meta analyses. However, over the years, different extensions have been published to address different types of methods, or review types, I should say. So there is, for instance, a Prisma for scoping reviews. That will be looked at in the fourth video on reporting your review itself. But there's also one that was developed for protocols and specifically for systematic review protocol. So that's the Prisma P extension. However, Peters and Company, they published a best practice guidance for scoping review protocols back in 2022. So that would be my go-to if you're looking for examples of protocols or what to include in a scoping review protocol. And you can decide to register your protocol or publish it. There are different venues for doing that should you be interested in making your protocol available. So what's included in a protocol? There are different sections that can be included. And one of those sections, obviously, is preliminary information. So what the title is, who the authors are, if there's any source of financing. Then guidance proposes that the introduction include the objectives of the review, as well as the review questions or the research questions, and then some general guidelines around the methods. So what are the inclusion exclusion criteria? Which sources will be used to identify the literature, and also providing one sample search strategy, usually from the main database that will be used. So a line-by-line search as an example as part of the protocol. And lastly, the last section of the protocol would include information of how data will be managed, um, how data will be selected, what will be extracted from the included studies, and how will all of that be synthesized. So again, just some very general points that can be included in a protocol. There is an example that's provided here that you could look for on the concept of mindful parenting. And their research question is basically what's the landscape of all empirical studies that include a focus on the construct of mindful parenting? How and in what contexts are these studies being conducted? So their review questions are pretty broad. They really don't have all the elements of PCC. They really just focus on the construct of mindful parenting, but that was their goal to try to find out what's out there on that concept. And so in their protocol, they outline their background and the review question itself, or questions in this case. They provide information about which sources will be searched. So there's a pretty thorough list of all the databases they plan on including. And they also outline their search strategy. They talk about how screening will happen and how data will be extracted and synthesized as well. So you'll notice in the DOI at the bottom of the slide, the OSF acronym, which stands for Open Science Framework. This is a platform where a lot of scoping review protocols are made available by review teams. There isn't a repository like there is for systematic reviews. So remember earlier I mentioned Prospero. There isn't one for scoping review protocols. And so people tend to either publish them in a journal or they self-publish it on OSF, which is a great place to find those types of examples to help you sort of structure your own. So all in all, we've looked at a lot of different points in this first section of this series on knowledge synthesis and specifically on scoping reviews. And just to highlight a few of those points very quickly, I think it's important to remember that all of this is not something that happens very quickly. So take time to really properly plan your review. As I mentioned just a few minutes ago, I've often seen teams come in and say, well, we have this idea of doing a review. This is generally what we want to do, but we really haven't thought through a lot of the process or a lot of the steps. So taking a step back and looking at protocols, for instance, or just structuring an outline of what would be planned out, thinking of who could help with the process as well. All of that sort of feeds into this initial phase of preparing your search. And taking time now will help you save time down the road as well, because you can look at what might be coming down the pipes in terms of the different phases. Also, very important, please to turn to methodological guidance. It's out there, it's available, it's very simple if we compare it to systematic reviews. So for scoping reviews, those two articles, the Arksey and O'Malley one and the Peters one, definitely are very succinct in terms of providing guidance and explaining the different steps that should be taken to conduct a scoping review. Also remember, your research question will guide you through everything. So the next three videos, it all comes back to the review question. So the more time you spend formulating it, perfecting it, and really feeling comfortable with it, and that it fits the scoping review model or method, then it will be a lot easier down the road as well. And lastly, and I'll mention this, I think, in all four videos, consult with your librarian. We have that expertise in terms of understanding the steps involved in the process, but also in terms of providing guidance and some examples to help you through these initial phases as well. So all in all, take the time to really prepare your scoping review. It will really guide you through the next phases.